Hello everyone, my name is Udita Sharma and I am currently working as an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at BSSS Bhopal. In our previous lectures, we have discussed the topics related to psychology of health and well-being. We had discussions around the meaning of health, illness and well-being. We also studied about the biopsychosocial model, followed by the meaning of stress and its consequences. Continuing the same, today we will be discussing about the concepts of coping. We will have a basic introduction, a brief overview about coping. So, let us begin today's lecture. Here is a brief overview of the lecture. We will begin with revising the meaning of stress, followed by understanding the general meaning of coping. Then we will try to understand what is the difference between adaptive and maladaptive coping. What are the individual differences that occur whenever we are on our respective paths of coping, and finally we will have a discussion about the goals of coping. Now let us get started. As discussed earlier, stress is often understood in form of a transaction. Whenever the situations in life feel as if they are too demanding or too overwhelming in comparison to the resources that you already have at your hand. So, stress is best understood as a transaction. If we look at a definition given by a very popular, a very famous researcher, Richard Lazarus, here is the definition. Richard Lazarus defined stress as a relationship between the person and the environment that is appraised as personally significant and as taxing or exceeding the resources for coping. As we discussed, stress is always seen as a transaction. So, this is what has also been depicted in this definition, in this very famous definition proposed by Lazarus, that your stress has to be appraised as personally significant and as taxing or exceeding the resources which you already have at your hand. Now, the biological mechanism of stress, there is an entire biological mechanism of stress. Your stress hormones are secreted, your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system takes its shift, that whenever your body goes under stress, your sympathetic nervous system gets activated, and whenever your body is at rest and relaxation, your parasympathetic nervous system gets activated. So, all of these things we had already covered in our previous lecture. Now, let us begin with coping. So, whenever there is a discussion of stress, there obviously has to be a discussion on coping, because coping, in the most basic sense, coping are your efforts, your coping mechanism is the modality or the methods, the ways in which you are trying to deal with the stress you already have. So, coping in simple terms can be described as ways in which individual tries to deal with stress experienced by him or her. So, coping is nothing but your strategies to cope up with the stress which you already have. Now, coping, mostly it is generally referred to as the deliberate efforts that are directed towards overcoming the stressor or decreasing the negative effect of the stressor. Now, these deliberate efforts towards decreasing the negative impact of stress, they might be psychological in nature, they might be social in nature, and they can also be physical in nature. So, your efforts to cope up with stress can be of a diverse situation, but whenever you are putting up efforts to cope up with stress, that accounts for your coping strategies or the way you cope up with the situation. Now, let us have a look at the two major domains of coping or the two major outcomes of coping. Now, whenever we talk about coping, it can either be adaptive or it can be maladaptive. See, stress often, specifically if we talk about distress, the negative kind of stress, it obviously has a negative impact on your life. So, whenever we talk about distress, it has a negative impact, and that is when the question of coping arises. The discussions and the researches of coping arise more often from that domain. So, whenever you are trying to cope up from a negative situation, it is not necessary that the outcome or the modality of coping up utilized by the individual will always be positive. It might be adaptive, it might be maladaptive. So, adaptive pattern of coping, adaptive, the generic meaning of adaptive also connotes something which is positive. So, And adaptive coping not only reduces stress, but it also has long term positive effects. Now, one modality of coping can be that you are looking at a quick relief gain in the shorter term, but in long run that modality of coping up might create some adverse consequences for you. That kind of coping does not account for adaptive coping. Adaptive coping is beneficial in the immediate scenario, and it will be beneficial in the futuristic scenario as well. Now, let us look at when will a coping strategy be considered to be an adaptive one. So, coping is termed as effective when it leads to recovery and when the individual is able to adapt to stressful situations by means of maintaining a positive self image. So, recovering from the adversity which has already occurred, recovering from the mental, physical, emotional damage that has already been done by the stress is very important whenever we talk about adaptive coping. And so, yeah, this was all about adaptive coping, a coping which is beneficial in the short term as well as in the long term, a coping which has a coping mechanism which has absolutely no form of say side effects. It will not harm you in any way. Now, if we take a look at maladaptive coping, it is the immediate opposite of it. So, maladaptive coping is one which can have negative impact on the physical as well as psychological health of the individual, as well as it might take a toll on your social functioning also. If we were to discuss few examples of adaptive and maladaptive coping, so things like channelizing your thoughts and energies in a creative manner, talking to a friend, exercising, taking therapy, seeking help, all of these things might come under adaptive coping mechanism, while avoidance, escapism, indulging in alcoholism and all of those things will account for maladaptive coping strategies. Now, let us take a look at what individual differences occur whenever you are trying to cope up with a situation. This heading itself, it tries to indicate or it tries to study that all of us are different individuals. Psychology has a lot of emphasis on individual differences. So, since all of us are different, our modalities of coping up also have to be different. So, what are the things, what are the factors which exactly cause these differences? That is what we have to discuss over here. So, the first basis on which our coping mechanisms can differ is your personality. Very obviously, based on our personality, your way of reacting to situations, your way of coping up with situations will keep on differing. For example, somebody who has a lot of emotional stability versus somebody who is high on neuroticism will have different approaches of coping and will have different abilities of coping. In the same manner, somebody who gets agitated very easily or somebody who is very impatient and somebody who is very patient in their nature will also have differing modalities of coping and differing outcomes of their coping. Second attribute on which our coping mechanisms differ is the level of hardiness and resilience. Now, in psychology, resilience refers to your ability to bounce back from adversity. An individual who is more resilient will be an individual who is able to cope up in a better manner, in a healthier manner, and probably in a way which is much smoother as somebody who is low in resilience. Same goes for hardiness. The concept of psychological hardiness includes three components: commitment, control and challenge. So, somebody who is high in psychological hardiness will also be able to cope up with situations in a better form. The next attribute on which our coping styles differ is the style of attribution. When we talk about style of attribution, it is majorly optimistic and pessimistic. Individuals who are optimistic, they tend to cope up with stressful situations quicker and more easily as compared to pessimistic individuals. Apart from these psychological attributes, we have also noticed gender differences in the way we cope up. So, men and women have different ways in which they cope up from situations. For instance, women are more prone to using coping strategies that target at bringing about change in emotional reactions. Women are known to focus more on emotional strategies in which they can control or in which they can work on their emotional strategies, while men are known to work on coping strategies wherein they focus on the problem itself. And apart from all of these psychological attributes like your personality, resilience, your style of attribution, gender, there can obviously be many more bases on which your coping styles will differ. For example, the materialistic resources which you have and the social support which you have. So, naturally somebody who has a lot of social support and a lot of social resources, that person will find it easier to cope up with stress as compared to a person who feels that they do not have sufficient social resources. So, these were just few major domains on the basis of which your coping mechanisms can differ, but there can be, the list can go on and on and on. Now that we have discussed about what all things can bring about a difference in coping, the way you cope up, let us finally take a look on the goals of coping, right. So, as I have already explained while I was explaining the meaning of coping up, that the basic and major goal of coping is to minimize the impact of the stressor, to combat the stressful situation. Apart from that, a few more goals of coping can be to enhance the possibility of recovery by decreasing the negative environmental conditions. So, coping also has a function related to recovery. So, to enhance the possibility of recovering, that is one goal. Secondly, to be able to adjust with the negative situation. For example, if there is an ongoing stressor in your life, your coping will also help you to cope, your coping mechanism will also help you to deal with that situation, whatever ongoing situation in your life is. The third goal of counseling is to maintain a self-image that is positive and to maintain emotional balance, a very important factor. Whenever we are under extreme stress or prolonged stress, it is very important to keep your emotional balance, and your ability or the efficiency with which you are able to keep up your emotional balance largely depends on your coping skills or your coping mechanisms. And finally, the last goal is to ensure positive interpersonal relationships even in the face of stress and adversity. So, to sum up in this lecture, we revised the meaning of stress followed by the meaning of coping. Coping, I will quickly summarize, are just your efforts, the ways in which you try to deal with that stress. Then we discussed the difference between adaptive coping and maladaptive coping, wherein adaptive is a positive form of coping and maladaptive is negative way of coping up, followed by individual differences in coping, and lastly we saw the goals of coping. In our upcoming video, we will discuss more about the different styles of coping. Thank you.